The Millionaire CEO never knew he had a daughter, until his ex called, begging him to save the little girl's life. Ryan Morgan never thought the day would come when a single phone call could unravel the fortress he had built around himself. He had spent years perfecting the image of the man who needed nothing and no one, the self-made millionaire whose success was as precise as the lines of his expensive suits. He believed that the decision to walk away from Lillian had been the final proof of that strength. He told himself he was simply choosing clarity over the messy complications of love. He convinced himself she had never really loved him and that she was relieved to be rid of him as he was to be rid of her. In all the time since, he had never once allowed himself to look back. But when her name flashed on his phone that night, something primal in him reacted before his mind caught up. For an instant he thought he had imagined it, some leftover guilt trying to trick him into longing for a past he had buried. He almost let the call go unanswered. Then he pressed the button and lifted the phone to his ear, braced for whatever accusation or plea she might hurl at him. What he heard instead was a voice he hardly recognized. Lillian did not sound like the woman he remembered, warm and clever and stubborn. She sounded as though the last bit of strength she had was slipping through her fingers. He sat down heavily on the edge of the leather couch, his free hand gripping the cushion. He could barely process the words as she spoke them, each one landing like a stone on his chest. There was a daughter he had never met. Her name was Hannah. She was 5 years old. She had cancer. Lillian's voice broke more than once as she explained how long the treatments had been failing, how she had held out hope until the doctors said there was nothing more to be done without resources she didn't have. He closed his eyes, but it didn't stop the images from forming. A little girl with Lillian's hair, with eyes that might match his own, lying in a hospital bed because he had been too proud to stay. He wanted to argue, to demand why she had kept this from him, to ask how she could possibly justify the silence. But the words lodged in his throat. There was something in her tone that made it impossible to be angry, something so nakedly afraid that it cut through every defense he had ever built. When she stopped speaking, there was only the sound of her breathing and the quiet hum of the city outside his window. He realized he had no idea what to say. He had made a career out of finding the perfect words, whether he was charming investors or dismantling an opponent across a boardroom table. Now, when it mattered most, he was mute. "Where are you?" he managed finally, and he hated how rough his voice sounded. She told him the name of the hospital, her voice catching as she repeated it to make sure he understood. He imagined her sitting there in some sterile room, a child, his child, fighting for her life. He didn't remember ending the call. He only knew that when he looked up, the room seemed to have changed shape. Every surface felt sharp and unwelcoming. The walls were too close. He moved automatically, pulling on his coat, grabbing his keys, locking the door behind him. Each motion felt disconnected from the next, as if he were watching someone else's hands. The elevator ride down to the parking garage lasted only seconds, but it felt as if an entire lifetime unspooled in that narrow box. He tried to remember all the times he had convinced himself he was better off alone, all the nights he had told himself that love was a liability. He wondered what it said about him that only the threat of losing something he had never even claimed could break through the armor he had spent so long perfecting. As he started the car and pulled into the empty street, he realized he had never been more terrified in his life. Not of failure, not of scandal, not even of the unknown. He was terrified because for the first time in years, he was about to step into something that couldn't be measured or controlled. He was driving toward a little girl who didn't know his name, and toward a woman he had hurt so deeply she hadn't dared to tell him he was a father. And no amount of money or power could change the fact that he was arriving too late. Ryan didn't remember the drive to the hospital in any clear sequence. He was aware only of how it felt to keep his hands clenched around the steering wheel, the ache that spread slowly up his forearms because he couldn't seem to loosen his grip. Every red light felt like an accusation. Every moment he was not yet there felt like a failure. He tried to imagine what he would say when he walked into that hospital room. He told himself he needed to be calm, that he couldn't arrive looking as shaken as he felt. But the more he rehearsed, the more he understood that nothing he could say would ever be enough to erase the choice he had made when he left. When he pulled into the parking lot, he sat with the engine idling, staring through the windshield at the low building that housed more pain and fear than he could comprehend. The hospital looked nothing like the shining towers where he held his business meetings, nothing like the private clinics he'd seen in glossy brochures. This place was ordinary, a little run down, and somehow that made it worse. He imagined Lillian carrying their daughter through those glass doors alone, sitting in the plastic chairs hour after hour while she waited for news no one wanted to hear. He killed the engine and stepped into the cold night air. Every part of him wanted to turn around, to tell himself this was some mistake and that he could go back to the life where he didn't know any of this was happening. But he knew he wouldn't. He had crossed a line the moment he answered that call. He pushed open the entrance and felt the hush of the corridor swallow him. The floor smelled of antiseptic and something stale and exhausted. He asked at the front desk for Lillian Morgan. The nurse looked up from her computer with an expression he couldn't read. For a split second, he wondered if Lillian had used his name all these years, if she had ever told Hannah that somewhere out there she had a father. He followed the nurse down a dim hallway, past rooms where other families kept vigil. Each doorway they passed felt like a reminder that he wasn't alone in his regret, that this building was full of people learning too late what really mattered. At the end of the hall, the nurse stopped and nodded toward a half-open door. Ryan paused there, his hand braced against the frame, and took one ragged breath before he looked inside. Lillian was sitting in a chair pulled up close to the bed. She had one hand resting lightly on a small bundle under the blankets. He could see only the curve of Hannah's cheek, pale as moonlight, and a trace of blonde hair peeking out from beneath a knit cap. Lillian didn't notice him at first. She was looking down at their daughter with an expression so raw it made his own chest ache. He realized he had never seen her this way. All the times he'd accused her of being manipulative, all the ways he'd doubted her, none of it fit the woman sitting there now, who looked as though she hadn't slept in weeks and couldn't remember how to hope. He didn't know what sound he made when he finally stepped across the threshold, but her head jerked up and her eyes found his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He had imagined anger, accusations, maybe even relief that he had finally come. But her face showed none of that. Only a tired, startled caution, as if she was afraid that if she blinked, he would vanish. He tried to clear his throat, but the words came out cracked and too soft. "I came as soon as you called." Her gaze dropped to Hannah again, and she brushed a fingertip across the little girl's temple. When she finally looked back at him, he saw that her eyes were red and shining but dry. "She's asleep," she whispered. "They gave her something for the pain." He nodded, because it was all he could do. He took a slow step closer, feeling like an intruder in a life he should have known. He tried to focus on Hannah, on the fragile curve of her ribs moving with each breath. He tried to find something to say that wouldn't make it worse. But all he could think was that this was his daughter, and he had never once held her, never once heard her laugh, never once told her he loved her. Lillian's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "They think the new treatment could help," she said, her tone steadier now. "But it's expensive. More than I have. More than most people have." He looked at her then, really looked, and felt the shame he had been trying to outrun rise like a tide in his throat. He realized she had called him not because she trusted him, not because she wanted him to come back into her life, but because she was a mother who would sacrifice anything to save her child. Even her pride. Even her peace. He swallowed and stepped closer until he was standing at the foot of the bed. "Then we'll do it," he said, and this time his voice didn't shake. "Whatever it takes." Lillian closed her eyes, and for the first time he saw her shoulders slump, as though she had been carrying the weight of the world and only now could set it down for a moment. When she looked at him again, there was no forgiveness in her face, but there was something else. Maybe the smallest flicker of relief. He thought that was more than he deserved. Ryan spent the first night sitting in a stiff plastic chair by the window, his hands resting on his knees because he didn't trust them not to tremble if he tried to touch Hannah's bed. The hospital room seemed too small to contain everything he was feeling. The rhythmic beep of the monitor felt louder than his thoughts. Every time Hannah shifted in her sleep or let out a weak sigh, he felt his breath catch, terrified that something would happen while he was sitting there, useless. He watched Lillian as she dozed in the chair beside their daughter, her arms folded tightly across her chest like she was holding herself together by force. He couldn't stop remembering the way she had looked at him when he arrived, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, as though she hadn't fully trusted that he would come even after she'd dialed his number. He knew he hadn't given her any reason to expect otherwise. Even now, after he'd promised he would help, she hadn't asked him to stay. She hadn't told him he was welcome. She had simply let him sit there because there was no more energy left to argue. Just before dawn, Lillian stirred and rubbed her eyes. When she noticed he hadn't moved, she studied him in silence. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, if she could still picture the man she had loved or if all she saw now was the man who had abandoned her. He didn't know which was worse. She stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from her neck, and moved to check the fluid line at Hannah's bedside. He wanted to offer help, but he didn't know how. He didn't know if it would only make things harder for her. The morning brought a shift change, a new nurse with a bright voice that felt too cheerful for a room like this. She explained the schedule for Hannah's tests and the treatment plan that might start as soon as the afternoon. Ryan listened, nodding even when he wasn't sure he could absorb another detail. Lillian's expression didn't change. He realized she must have heard the same explanations over and over, and she had long since learned to keep her hope under lock and key. When the nurse left, the quiet came back so suddenly that he felt it like a blow. Lillian sat down in her chair again, resting her elbows on her knees, and for a long moment they didn't speak. It was easier not to. But eventually he knew he had to say something, because pretending this was normal would be one more lie. He drew in a slow breath. "Lillian, I don't expect you to forgive me." His voice was hoarse from hours without sleep. "But I want you to know that I'm not going to disappear again. No matter what happens." She didn't look at him, but her jaw tightened like she was holding something back. "You say that now," she said quietly. "But you have no idea how hard this gets. How lonely." "I'm starting to understand," he admitted, because it was the only honest thing he could offer. "I know that doesn't mean much coming from me. But I'm here." She lifted her gaze just enough to meet his eyes. In that moment, he thought she might tell him to leave after all, that she would rather do this alone than risk believing he had changed. But instead she looked back down at Hannah and reached out to straighten the edge of her blanket. He could see her hands shaking, just a little. He felt an ache so deep it left him hollow. All the success he had ever chased, all the security he had built, none of it mattered here. None of it could protect a child from this. None of it could give back the time he had wasted. He thought about the first 5 years of Hannah's life, all the moments he had missed, first words, first steps, first birthday candles. He tried to picture her learning to walk, her small arms reaching out for someone who wasn't him. The shame was so heavy it felt like it might crush him. The hours passed slowly. A doctor came in to check on Hannah and spoke in measured tones about the treatment plan. There were statistics Ryan tried not to hear, numbers that sounded too close to final. Lillian listened without interrupting, her face pale but calm. He wondered if that calm was something she had learned or something she had always carried, waiting for the day when it would be tested. After the doctor left, Lillian stood and moved to the window. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared out at the parking lot where the early morning light was breaking over the asphalt. He watched her shoulders rise and fall, saw the way she turned her face away so he wouldn't see her expression. He knew she was trying not to cry. He knew because he was doing the same thing. He didn't know how long they stood in that silence. He only knew that when Hannah stirred and let out a small whimper, Lillian was beside her in an instant, her hands smoothing over her daughter's hair with a gentleness that made something crack open in his chest. He took a step closer, and when Hannah's eyes fluttered open, he saw the confusion there, the question she didn't yet have words for. It was the first time she really looked at him. He felt his breath stop as her gaze settled on his face, those impossibly blue eyes so much like his own. He knew he would never be able to forget that moment. He didn't deserve it, but he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. Ryan lost track of how long he stood at Hannah's bedside, watching her eyes blink slowly open and then drift shut again under the weight of medication. He felt strangely afraid to speak, as if any word might shatter the fragile peace in the room. Lillian stayed close to the bed, her hand resting on Hannah's back in a way that made something tighten behind his ribs. He realized she must have spent countless nights like this, anchored to this small body by a love so fierce it refused to let go no matter how exhausted she became. He wondered how she had survived carrying that burden alone and felt the sharpest regret of his life that he hadn't been there to share it. Eventually, Lillian turned to look at him. The pallor of her face and the shadows under her eyes told him she hadn't slept properly in weeks, maybe months. But there was a steadiness in her gaze that made him feel like the smallest man alive. She gestured to the other chair and he hesitated, not sure if he was allowed to cross that invisible line between them. When he finally sat down, the old tension between them returned, a heavy awareness that nothing about this moment could erase the past. Lillian's voice was low when she finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd answer when I called." He opened his mouth to respond, but she kept going, her words gathering momentum like she'd been waiting too long to say them. "I didn't want to call you. You made it so clear that you were done with me, with any life that wasn't about your work. But when the doctors said I couldn't wait any longer, I didn't have a choice." She looked away then, her fingers twisting the edge of Hannah's blanket. "You have to understand that this wasn't about you. It was about her." "I do understand," he said quietly, though he knew he could never fully grasp how much it must have cost her to pick up the phone and dial his number after all the ways he had failed her. Lillian didn't reply, and for a while the only sounds were the slow, steady beeps of the monitors. He tried to imagine what she'd been through over these 5 years, how she must have woken up every day knowing she alone was responsible for every scraped knee, every fever, every fear in the dark. He tried to picture Hannah learning to say, "Mama," learning to walk, learning to trust, all without any memory of him. The weight of it pressed into his chest like a stone. After a long time, Lillian spoke again, her voice softer. "She doesn't know who you are." He nodded, unable to pretend he deserved any other reality. She hesitated, then continued. "If you're going to be here, you have to understand that. You can't expect her to love you just because you finally showed up." He met her eyes, wishing he could promise her he would never fail them again. "I don't expect anything," he said, and meant it. "I only want to do whatever I can. For her. For you, if you'll let me." Lillian's expression didn't change, but he thought he saw a flicker of something that might have been relief. She looked back down at Hannah, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. He studied the curve of her shoulders, the way her hand never wavered as it rested protectively over their daughter's heart. He had always known she was strong, but sitting there in that dim hospital room, he finally understood what strength looked like. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt as though he was on the edge of something he couldn't define. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't even acceptance. It was simply a moment when neither of them could pretend any longer that the past didn't matter or that the present could wait. When he opened his eyes again, Lillian was watching him. Her face was still wary, but her voice was steadier. "The doctors will come in soon," she said. "They'll explain everything. You should hear it from them, too." He nodded. In that simple exchange, he felt something shift between them, the first thin thread of understanding that might someday be strong enough to hold more. He didn't know how to make it grow. He only knew he would be here to try. When the doctors finally entered the room, Ryan felt the air change. Even Lillian straightened in her chair, her hand hovering protectively over Hannah's blanket as though she could shield her from every word that was about to be spoken. The lead oncologist, a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, nodded politely to Ryan before she began outlining the treatment plan in careful, measured language. The words felt unreal, like some foreign code he could barely translate: chemotherapy, central line, bone marrow biopsy, cycles, remission rates. Each term landed on him with the dull weight of inevitability. He watched Lillian as she listened, her eyes fixed steadily on the doctor's face. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't betray anything but the barest tightening of her jaw when the risks were discussed. He realized this wasn't the first time she had sat through conversations like this. She had probably lost count of how many times she'd listened to strangers in white coats talk about her daughter's future as though it were a set of probabilities. And she had done it all alone. When the doctor turned to him, asking if he had any questions, he opened his mouth and then closed it again. His mind felt like a blank sheet. It struck him that he had never in his life felt so completely out of his depth. No amount of business acumen or wealth could prepare him to process the possibility that Hannah might not survive no matter what he did. He swallowed and finally managed to ask if there was anything more they could do. The doctor looked at him with tired compassion and said quietly that the proposed protocol was the most aggressive option available. Then she glanced at Lillian, as if confirming she understood the plan and would consent to it. Lillian nodded once, a tiny movement that somehow seemed enormous. The doctor handed them a sheaf of papers and quietly left the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Ryan picked up the consent forms and stared down at the words. He saw Lillian watching him, and for the first time he realized she was waiting to see if he would flinch. If he would read about the cost, the duration, the uncertainty, and decide it wasn't worth it. He lifted his gaze to meet hers and felt the truth settle in his chest. He would spend every cent he had, every ounce of energy, and every day of his life if that's what it took to give their daughter a chance. Without looking away from her, he picked up the pen and signed where the doctor had marked. Something in Lillian's posture eased, though she said nothing. She reached to take the papers and set them neatly aside. For a few moments they both just sat there, breathing the same heavy air, neither one able to name the emotion rising between them. He wished he could take her hand, offer some comfort, but he knew he hadn't earned the right. When Hannah stirred, letting out a small whimper, Lillian moved instantly to the side of the bed. She smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead, her voice low and steady as she whispered soothing words. Ryan watched, feeling as though he were seeing a part of her he had never really known. She looked up once, and for an instant, their eyes locked. He saw the question there: was he really going to stay? And for the first time, he felt she might be willing to believe the answer. The hours that followed blurred into a strange rhythm of waiting. Nurses came and went. Hannah woke for a little while, her gaze flicking between them with vague confusion, too weak to speak. Lillian coaxed her to sip water, her voice soft and patient. Ryan wanted to help, but every attempt felt clumsy. He tried to adjust the blanket and succeeded only in knocking her stuffed rabbit onto the floor. He bent to pick it up, but by the time he straightened, he saw the small line of tears slipping down Hannah's cheek. His heart twisted so sharply he almost dropped the toy again. Lillian took the rabbit from his hand and placed it gently beside Hannah. "It's all right," she murmured without looking at him. "She just gets scared when she wakes up." "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't about the rabbit or his awkwardness. He was apologizing for every absence, every lost year, every moment she had faced alone. Lillian didn't answer, but after a long time, she moved the chair slightly so there was enough space for him to sit closer. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't acceptance, but it was something. A small beginning. And as he sat there, his shoulder almost touching hers, he realized he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove he deserved it. The first week of Hannah's treatment passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear that Ryan had never known before. He spent every day at the hospital, arriving before dawn and leaving only when the nurses insisted that Lillian and he needed rest. Even then, he rarely went farther than the small waiting lounge down the hall, where he would sit hunched over a paper cup of stale coffee, staring at the linoleum floor until his thoughts blurred into one long ache. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hannah's pale face or the way her tiny hand curled around Lillian's thumb when the pain grew too much. He wondered how Lillian had survived all those months without any help, how she had kept breathing when it would have been so easy to fall apart. He realized how little he had understood about strength until he saw her in that hospital room, night after night, never leaving Hannah's side. Sometimes when Hannah was asleep, Lillian would allow herself to lean back in her chair, her eyelids fluttering shut. In those moments, the lines of her face softened, and he could almost see the woman she had been before the fear and sleepless nights hollowed her out. He caught himself remembering the early days of their relationship, how her laughter had once filled every corner of his apartment, how he had taken for granted the way she looked at him as though she believed he was good. He would have given anything to go back to that time and tell her he was sorry before he ever had to be. During the worst nights, Hannah's fever would rise until her body trembled, and Lillian would climb into the narrow hospital bed to hold her. Ryan would sit at the foot of the mattress, feeling helpless, wishing there was something he could offer that mattered. More than once, he reached out without thinking, his hand brushing Lillian's ankle or her shoulder, some wordless plea to let him share the burden. Sometimes she flinched, and sometimes she didn't. They never spoke about it afterward. When the doctors came to check on Hannah, they spoke to Lillian first, as if she were the only parent in the room. Ryan didn't resent it. He understood that in every way that mattered, she had been. Still, when the oncologist began explaining the small signs of progress, a slightly stronger immune count, a decrease in her pain, Ryan felt something crack inside his chest. Hope was the most dangerous feeling he had ever known, and he clung to it with both hands even as he braced himself for the next setback. Late one evening, after Hannah had finally drifted into a deeper sleep, Lillian stepped into the hallway to talk to the nurse about her medications. Ryan stayed by the bed, studying his daughter's face in the dim glow of the monitor. He traced every delicate feature with his eyes, searching for some proof that she knew he was there. He leaned closer and whispered, almost too quietly to hear, that he was sorry for every birthday he'd missed, for every bedtime story he hadn't read, for every night she had fallen asleep without knowing she was loved by him. He didn't expect her to understand or to forgive him. But saying it felt necessary, as if the words themselves might plant a seed of something better between them. When Lillian came back, she stood in the doorway and watched him in silence. He thought she might tell him to leave, that his guilt was selfish and that he didn't have the right to unburden himself onto a child who was fighting for her life. But instead she walked slowly to the chair beside him and sat down without speaking. She didn't look at him, but after a moment, she shifted so their arms brushed. It was the smallest touch, but it felt as momentous as any declaration. They sat like that for a long time, their shoulders just touching while Hannah breathed softly in her sleep. For once, the quiet didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like an understanding neither of them had words for yet. When a nurse came to check the monitors, she paused as if she were about to say something, then moved on without comment. Ryan didn't know if she recognized that something important was happening in that silence, that it was the first fragile beginning of trust. By the time dawn lit the corners of the room, he felt changed. Not redeemed, not forgiven, but steadier. He knew he would never stop carrying regret for all the time he had wasted. But as he watched Lillian tuck the blanket around their daughter's small frame, he began to believe that maybe he still had time left to become someone better than he had been. On the seventh day, something shifted between them in a way that neither Ryan nor Lillian could have anticipated. It began in the quiet hours before dawn, when the overhead lights were dimmed and the only sounds were Hannah's slow breathing and the hum of the machines. Ryan had been sitting in the same chair for hours, unable to close his eyes for more than a few minutes at a time, because every time he drifted off he dreamed that he was arriving too late to say goodbye. Lillian, who had barely spoken more than a few words to him since he arrived, finally let her exhaustion show. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on her folded arms beside Hannah's pillow, and for a moment, her shoulders shook in a way that told him she was crying as quietly as she could. He didn't speak or try to touch her. He simply watched, feeling the ache in his own throat, and understood that no apology he could offer would ever be enough to erase the fear she had carried alone. But for the first time, he didn't feel like an intruder in this room. He felt like he belonged there as much as she did, that his place was not in some corner pretending to be unaffected, but beside her, carrying whatever weight she would let him take. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were rimmed red, but she didn't look away in shame. Instead, she met his gaze with a raw honesty that startled him. She whispered that she was so tired she didn't know how to keep doing this, and that sometimes she was afraid she would run out of hope before Hannah did. Her voice broke on the word hope, and he heard in that single syllable all the nights she had stayed awake, all the mornings she had forced herself to smile for their daughter. Without thinking, he reached across the narrow space and laid his hand over hers. He expected her to pull away, to remind him he had no right to pretend closeness now. But she didn't move. For several long seconds, they sat like that, her palm under his, breathing the same stale hospital air, and he knew that this was more than forgiveness. It was a fragile acknowledgement that he was here now, and that counted for something. Later that day, Hannah woke up more alert than she had been all week. She turned her head toward them and mumbled something that neither of them could understand. Lillian leaned close, brushing the hair off her forehead, and Ryan saw the small smile on her lips when Hannah finally managed to whisper Mama. He felt something tighten behind his ribs, the complicated ache of gratitude and jealousy and regret, because he knew he had missed every moment that led to this. But when Hannah looked past Lillian and fixed those wide blue eyes on him, he felt an electric shock of recognition. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was steady and curious, as if she was trying to decide whether he was safe. Lillian glanced over her shoulder and nodded once, a small encouragement he hadn't expected. He shifted closer to the bed, feeling clumsy and too large for the delicate world their daughter inhabited. He murmured her name, testing how it felt to say it out loud, and when her eyes didn't waver, he let himself smile for the first time in what felt like years. For the next hour, he sat beside her, answering the few questions she was strong enough to ask. He told her that he was there to help and that he wasn't going anywhere. Lillian didn't interrupt or correct him. She only watched with an expression he couldn't decipher, something between relief and sorrow. That evening, as the sun slipped below the hospital roofs, Hannah fell asleep holding Lillian's hand in one fist and the corner of Ryan's jacket in the other. He felt that small weight like an anchor, tethering him to the moment. When he looked across the bed and met Lillian's tired gaze, he knew she understood exactly what it meant. They didn't speak again before the nurse came to dim the lights. They didn't have to. In that shared silence, something shifted irrevocably. For the first time, Ryan let himself believe that no matter how much damage he had caused, there might still be a way back to the family he had never let himself imagine. The morning Hannah was strong enough to be moved out of intensive care was the first time Ryan allowed himself to exhale without fear that it would be his last moment with her. He arrived early, before the doctors made their rounds, and found Lillian already awake, smoothing Hannah's hair and whispering something that made the little girl's tired smile flicker to life. The room was bathed in thin, uncertain sunlight that made everything look fragile, like a dream that could vanish if he looked away too long. He paused in the doorway, watching them, and felt a kind of wonder he had never known, because for the first time in his life, he saw something he could not buy or control or guarantee, a tiny, stubborn hope that maybe this child could survive, and that maybe, somehow, he could be the father she deserved. When Lillian noticed him, she didn't stiffen the way she had the first days. She didn't look relieved either, but her shoulders didn't tense, and she didn't glance toward the door as though she was waiting for him to leave. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, an unspoken invitation to come closer, and he did, crossing the floor with careful steps. He felt as though he was moving through the remnants of all the years they'd lost, each step a silent apology for every day he hadn't been there. The nurse came in to disconnect the line that had kept Hannah tethered to the machines. Hannah whimpered once, too weak to cry properly, and Lillian leaned close to kiss her cheek. When the nurse stepped away, Ryan reached for the small stuffed rabbit that had never left Hannah's side. He held it out, unsure if she would take it from him, but she reached for it with a shy, tentative hand. When her fingers closed over the soft ear, he felt something catch in his chest, a fragile, impossible relief. They moved her slowly into a new room, this one smaller and warmer, with a window that looked out over a courtyard where a few stunted trees tried to bloom in the late spring chill. The nurses spoke in quiet, optimistic voices about how this meant she was stabilizing. Ryan knew it didn't mean she was cured, that remission was still only a possibility, but he let himself hold on to the idea that this was a step forward. When they were alone again, Lillian sat in a single chair by the bed, and he stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of her seat. They didn't speak for a long time. It was easier to watch Hannah as she drifted in and out of shallow sleep, her small hand still curled around the rabbit. At one point, Lillian turned to look up at him, and her eyes were clearer than he'd seen them in weeks. She didn't say thank you, and he was grateful for that, because he hadn't earned her gratitude. But there was something almost like peace in her expression, something that told him she was no longer carrying the burden alone. That afternoon, a social worker came to speak with them about arranging longer-term care and therapy. Ryan listened to the list of options, the daunting estimates of costs and timelines, and he realized he wasn't afraid of any of it. He signed every form without hesitation, not caring about the price. No investment had ever mattered more. When the woman left, Lillian let out a long breath and leaned back in her chair. She didn't look at him, but her voice was quiet and steady when she finally spoke. She told him that she didn't know what would happen next, that she still couldn't promise him a place in their lives after this was over. But she said she was willing to try, and that Hannah deserved the chance to know him if he truly meant to stay. He felt the words settle over him like absolution he didn't deserve but needed more than he'd ever needed anything. He promised her he would not walk away again, no matter what. As evening fell, he watched Lillian lean forward to kiss Hannah's forehead, and he realized he was watching the woman he had once loved and still did, though he didn't know if he had any right to say so. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and he didn't expect it. Instead, he pulled another chair to the opposite side of the bed and sat down so that Hannah could see him when she woke. He rested his hand lightly on the edge of her blanket, careful not to startle her, and for the first time, he felt her fingers twitch toward his. When he looked across at Lillian, she was watching him without suspicion or accusation, just a quiet, exhausted understanding that they were finally standing on the same side of something bigger than either of them. He knew there were still years of mistakes to reckon with, that she might never trust him fully again, but that night, in that quiet hospital room, he let himself believe that maybe there was a way to rebuild what he had broken. And if it took the rest of his life, he would be there every single day to prove it. I think the ending of this story feels exactly as it should, honest, imperfect, and full of hard-won hope. What makes it powerful is that it doesn't pretend redemption happens all at once. Ryan doesn't magically erase the years of absence or the pain he caused by walking away. Instead, he learns that real love means staying present, even when you feel unworthy, and showing up again and again without expecting forgiveness on a timeline. I appreciate how the story resists turning into a fairy tale. Lillian's willingness to let him be part of Hannah's life isn't a reward for his regret, it's a choice rooted in what's best for their daughter, and in the fragile possibility that trust can be rebuilt brick by brick. The ending is hopeful but honest about how much work lies ahead. What touched me most is that Ryan finally understands that love isn't measured by grand gestures or wealth but by the smallest acts of care and consistency. For a man who defined himself by control, learning to sit in uncertainty beside the people he loves is a true transformation. To me, this ending is a reminder that sometimes the most important redemption isn't loud or dramatic, it's simply refusing to leave again. And that quiet choice is what makes the story feel real and moving.